Okay, so one of the things that my former students will also remember is I always forget to press record on Zoom. So I've just had to press record on Zoom, so my apologies for that. So over the last 10 years, this has been a particular subject of interest for me, particularly over the last 5 years. What I would say to people who are joining, especially those of you who are from a political science background or a diplomacy background or an international relations background, is that I don't work in a school of politics. I don't work in a school of international relations. My background is as a business school academic. A lot of the work I do within the sport industry is with businesses, with commercial partners. And so what you're going to get today is my view from a business and management perspective of what soft power is in sport. What I'm also going to do is really to frame, I think, the discussion and to frame the benefits about soft power in terms of business. And so the examples that I use very much reflect a very personal perspective on all of this. Otherwise, just to say, this is very much an emergent area. For those of you who either are attending university or working in university, or for that matter, working for a sponsor, working for a club, so on and so forth, a lot of what is written about soft power tends to be written by people working in political fields or international relation fields or the field of diplomacy. And so, again, what I'm going to provide is something that I think is very different. I will give some readings that come from a more business-focused perspective. But in that context, what I would say to you is if you're looking at this from a business and management perspective, there's not a lot of work out there written on this. This is a new and emergent field, and so in one sense, it can be difficult to be precise. It can be difficult to bring lots of content to what we're going to talk about. But at the same time, it's also a fantastic opportunity. And I think that for anybody looking to write a dissertation, for anybody looking to undertake a PhD, for anybody who's trying to understand what's happening in global sport at the moment, there's tremendous potential and real opportunities to do some interesting work in this area. So to begin with, just a question, if I may. Let me see how I do this. There. Okay, so can I start with a very simple question, which is, for all of you who are sat in the room, I want you to go to the chat bar in the side, and what I want you to do is effectively in the chat bar, just write down what's your favorite Premier League team and why. So I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. So what's your favorite Premier League team and why, in the chat bar at the side. So like Roberts, Louis, Isaac, Nuna, Alberto, Isabella, Jan, George, Brett, Charlie, Craig, Aya, Crystal, Melina. Whoa, it's just incredible. Okay, cool. That's exactly what I wanted. You can carry on if you want. Lewis, never mind. Your team. Mikel, Arsenal, never mind. Arsenal again, never mind. Liverpool. Craig, you know the team that matters. That's all I'll say. Oh, how many Arsenal fans are here today? Oh my God. What is wrong with you people? Arsenal BC because of French culture. Okay. Manchester City, Liverpool, Klopp, Middlesbrough. Nicolas. Yeah, you got it. Middlesbrough is the one and only team in red that counts. Chelsea, Shevchenko. Cool. Thank you very much for writing that all down. And that's exactly what I wanted you to do. So if I can go back to my presentation. So what we're going to do today is to talk a little more about what you've just written in a second. As ever with these webinars, just to say a quick thank you. as always, as with the other webinars, just to tell you a little bit about why we're doing this. So as we go through the course of today, if there's anything that you want to say, if there's anything that you want to post, if you want to ask any questions, you can post them using the hashtag SportAssist. For those of you who have not joined before, SportAssist is a group of academics who've offered support and help to students, particularly during this difficult time. And so what we've been able to do, for example, is provide some materials to recommend some readings. I know that 1 or 2 academics are now talking to students who aren't their own to assist them with work that they're doing. So by all means, after today is finished, please, if you want to ask anything you want to post, you can do via SportAssist. There are some questions coming through. I'll try to look at those later. Depending upon how much time we've got, I may be able to answer them directly. But if they're pressing questions, if they're burning questions that you really want to ask, then please feel free to post via hashtag SportAssist, and I'll try and look at them later. In terms of readings, the readings that you'll find on soft power are political readings. And I guess the seminal work is the one in the center there by Joseph Nye on soft power. This is the seminal work, and certainly most, if not all, of the studies on soft power that you might read will reference Nye's work. So that's a good starting point. Personally, I like the top book, the Routledge Handbook of Soft Power, because it's long. There's lots of content. I think it looks at soft power in lots of different ways. There is some specific reference to sport, but not explicitly and not extensively. As regards the final one, I don't actually have this book at the moment. I don't have a copy of it. So this is newly published on the forces of attraction in international relations. So I would recommend that the first 2 and the last one. I've not looked at it, but it's certainly something that I'll be looking to get over the next few weeks. Quick and easy readings, and at this point I would like to name check a colleague and co-worker of mine, Dr. Paul Widdop of Manchester Metropolitan University. Several of these pieces that you can see there I've produced in conjunction with Paul, not all of them but some of them. And what you'll see there is obviously this is me and in certain cases Paul trying to more explicitly think about soft power from a sports perspective, and trying to understand where sport and soft power overlap. I reiterate again, however, that from my perspective, from a very personal perspective, what I'm interested in is where sport and business, and increasingly where politics intersect. What I would also emphasize to you, and many of you know this already, I have a particular interest in Eurasia. So if you draw a red thread from Reykjavik in Iceland across to Tokyo in Japan, anything that's along that red line is what interests me. So what you'll find there, certainly in terms of the referencing, and also in terms of the examples that I'm going to use today, are very much Eurasian examples. However, what I would invite you to think about is that the soft power game is not just a Eurasian game. It's also a North American game. If you think about, for instance, the NBA and the power that the NBA has across the world, some of you will know there was supposed to have been an African NBA already up and running, which has been postponed, or the start has been postponed due to COVID-19. Some of you will also know that there are moves by the NBA to move into India. The NBA is very active in China. And so I think the United States and United States sport are very much part of the soft power landscape. But I would even draw your attention to, for instance, and I'll just use one more example, Brazilian football and soft power. And if you think about traditional views or traditional notions of what many of us might think about Brazilian football, in fact, if I was to pose the question to you now, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Brazilian football? You'd probably think great, successful, skillful, and all of those other things. And so what you'd start to do is to you'd start to draw conclusions about, you'd begin to make associations with, you'd begin to make generalizations, you would convey particular characteristics or project particular characteristics onto Brazil on the basis of its football. And in essence, that's what soft power is. And so what I would invite you to do is, yes, listen to me and think about Eurasia, but also think about Brazil and the United States and the indomitable lions, Cameroon, and lots and lots of other examples that fit into this soft power landscape. Now I'm going to go back to what we talked about a little earlier in terms of what's your favourite team and why, what's your favourite Premier League team and why, and we'll explain, or I'll explain why I asked that in just a second. But to begin with, let me talk about taxis. And some of you already who are new to all of this will be thinking, why is he talking about taxis? He's supposed to be talking about sport. Hey, this is what my classes are like. So for those of you who've been in my classes before, this is how, this is how I work. There is a point, okay? There is a point to this. It's like a good joke. You've got to build up to the punchline. So let's start by talking about taxis. I've got a particular view about taxis. I travel the world a lot. I spend a lot of time, everywhere, lots of places in Asia, in Europe, in South America, in North America, a little bit in Africa, lots in the Middle East. And I always make sure that I travel in the front of taxis. And the reason for that is taxi drivers are geniuses. And for those of you who are British, you'll know that in a popular quiz program here several years ago, a taxi driver won this quiz. It was kind of a mental challenge quiz, and he won. And so taxi drivers are much maligned and much dismissed group of people because they know lots and lots of things. They're incredibly bright people. So my tip is always sit in the front of a taxi when you go somewhere, because taxi drivers are interesting people. But what I do in addition to that when I go abroad is travel in front of the taxi so you can talk to the taxi driver, not just because they're bright people, but as you sit there silently driving through the streets, my opening line always is, what's your favourite Premier League team and why? And I would say probably in about 75% of cases, the taxi driver will say, I like Arsenal because, I like Manchester United because. I was actually in Beijing in 2017, and I asked the taxi driver, who didn't speak very good English, what's your favourite Premier League football team? And he said, Coventry City, which, given that Coventry City haven't been in the Premier League since 2004, was a really interesting answer. But still, I thought it was a good answer. It was an interesting answer. He obviously had his reasons for doing that. Now, I don't want to stop sharing the screen now and go back to look at what you just posted in terms of what your favourite team is and why. But what was really interesting is as soon as I asked you to post what's your favourite team and why, you just did it. And a conversation started. And let's say, for example, I had asked you, what's your favourite light engineering business and why? I think most of you would have logged off and gone to eat your lunch or your evening meal or whatever. You just don't have a view about light engineering businesses. As I sit here now, I'm actually struggling even to think about the name of a light engineering business. So what we know is that whether you're taking a webinar on Zoom or you're sat in the front of a taxi in Beijing or in Doha or in Los Angeles or in Rio de Janeiro, and you say to someone, what's your favorite Premier League team? Very often taxi drivers will be able to tell you, and you will start a conversation. And what will happen when you talk to the taxi driver is the taxi driver will say, oh yeah, I remember there was a great player. I remember there was a game against, I remember the time that they won 5-0. I do have teams here as well. And what very often happens is taxi drivers will always also say to you, "Oh, my favorite team in Brazil is," or "My favorite team in Italy is." The point I'm trying to make by asking you, and also by talking about taxi drivers, is this starts conversations, but it's more than that. It breaks down barriers. It uh, it overcomes communication obstacles. It overcomes cultural barriers. It creates common understanding. What I very often find is when I go to, for instance, certain parts of the Middle East, the taxi drivers are desperate to talk about the Premier League because most of the time, they don't get English guys sat in the front of their taxis wanting to talk about the Premier League. And so it's also a great way of connecting. It's also a great way of building relationships. And in essence, this is soft power. This is the soft power of football. Now, obviously, this is anecdotal, and it's based upon my personal experience. But what you will find there is that, and for all of your Manchester United fans out there, for all the fans of other teams, I just chose the picture of Paul Pogba because there's nothing implied here. This is not my team, and he's not necessarily my favorite player in the Premier League. Interesting guy. We can talk about it another time. But when you start to talk about the Premier League, maybe you'll talk about Old Trafford, maybe you'll talk about Liverpool, maybe you'll talk about Southampton, maybe you'll talk about Paul Pogba, who knows? But people very often have a view. And going back to what I said earlier, 75% of taxi drivers will say, "Oh, my favorite team is." What they'll then go on to tell you is they'll go on to say things like, "It's really fast and it's really exciting." Interestingly, I was in a hotel in Italy about 9 years ago when Barcelona were really at their prime and Guardiola was the coach and they were playing tiki-taka football. And I stood watching the TV and there was a guy next to me and I said to the guy, "This is just great football. This Barcelona football is great football." It turned out he was from Sweden and he said, "Nah, I hate it." He said, "Give me English football anytime." "Why is that?" "Why?" And he said, "Because you kick the ball and you run after it and it's fast and exciting and there are lots of goals." And so what you tend to find is that people, when they talk about the Premier League, they associate particular qualities and characteristics with it, which may or may not be true, but that's what their perception is. And that enables, therefore, a conversation to start. And that conversation can serve several purposes. Now, I'm talking here about Premier League football. We could be talking about American NBA. We could be talking about baseball in Japan. We could be talking about cricket in Italy. So all of these sports have a soft power effect. And hopefully by the time we get out of the webinar today, you'll understand a little more about what that effect is. Now, for those of you who are out there who are still thinking, "Well, I don't really know what Simon's getting at," be patient. There's more. But if I was to give you another example from another sector, think about McDonald's. McDonald's is American soft power. Hollywood movies are American soft power. I particularly like the McDonald's example because with McDonald's, no matter where you go in the world, McDonald's is pretty much always the same. Yes, there are some differences. There are some regional variations, but the layout of the stores, the way in which the food is served, how you consume that food, and so on and so forth, are pretty much the same. And people have associations with McDonald's that enables them to consume that product with ease. So there is a literature, there is research, there are people writing about the soft power, the US soft power of McDonald's, for instance. And one of the things that we'll do next week, we'll talk a little more when we're talking about Asian nations and sport policy. When we do the webinar next week, we'll talk a little bit about how Asian nations are using soft power in these terms. So to think a little bit more tangibly about this, so we know that lots of people are prepared to say, I have a Premier League football team. This is why I support this Premier League team. And here are some stories that I can tell you about the Premier League. And when people begin to think about the Premier League, they begin to have certain associations, many of them positive, sometimes not, but many of them positive. And so the Premier League is an important vehicle or an important channel through which Britain can project, can build and project soft power. Some of you may be familiar with, many of you may not be familiar with Premier Skills English. And Premier Skills is a project, an initiative that is delivered jointly by the British Council and the Premier League. Now, try to think this through. So the British Council, for those of you who are familiar with it, for those of you who are not familiar with it, Institut Français, for example, or Confucius Institute in France and China, respectively, are similar types of organization. But the British Council is a channel through which British soft power is projected. And what it essentially is trying to do is to get different audiences, target audiences around the world to engage with England, with Great Britain. And I think this particular initiative is really interesting and important. Now today, what's really great about today, so just looking at the quick numbers, we've got 226 people online today. I'm speaking English, you're listening in English, you're posting your replies in English, perfect. Because that's exactly what this is all about. If 226 of you were all from different nationalities, from different nations, and you couldn't speak English, then we'd have to simultaneously translate 226 times. Now the cost of that would be immense. So if we were to have 226 simultaneous translators, we just wouldn't do this. We just wouldn't have a webinar because it would be too much money. It would cost too much. The other thing, we'd have to go out and find 226 translators. There'd then be the technological infrastructure of trying to make 226 translators work. It would be incredibly complex. So therefore, it's just better if you all speak English and communicate in English, because in simple terms, it minimizes the transaction costs. There's less cost involved. There's also the issue around enabling things to happen. So the reason that you can all speak English, you can understand English, you can post in English is a good thing, because it therefore means that the relationships between us are much easier to facilitate. That is soft power. And what we have here is soft power through the British Council aligning with soft power being projected through the Premier League. And in this site, Premier Skills English, what you do is you can learn to speak English by talking football. And this is the power of football, and this is soft power in action. To give you another example, and I'm going to go on to some more detailed explanation in just a second, but to give you another example, we've got a press release here that you can find on the British government website about an event that took place in Doha, in Qatar in 2016. Some of you may be aware, I guess most of you will be aware, that in 2022, the World Cup is taking place in Qatar. Personally, I still think the Qataris harbour aspirations of one day hosting the Olympic Games. In the meantime, we've got lots of events taking place there. We've recently had the Club World Cup taking place in Doha. And so what the British government has proactively and strategically done is to target politicians and key decision makers in Qatar through a series of events. And you can see this is a screenshot of one of the events that took place in November 2016. Now, what's particularly interesting about, for example, the Department for International Trade, the British Department for International Trade, which is a British government department, is when they go on such trade missions or they hold such meetings, they often will take representatives from a Premier League football club along with them. Now, in this particular case, at this meeting, the British government took Tottenham Hotspur with them. And you know how this works. You know, okay, we're going to sit and listen about some politicians making decisions and about trying to build relationships between the two countries. And what Britain is essentially trying to do is it's pitching for business. You know, so with the Qatar World Cup coming up, it's pitching for business. It wants to be its businesses to be supplying steel. It wants its businesses to be supplying ticketing systems. It wants its businesses to be supplying, you know, food and beverage within the venues, and so on and so on and so on. You know, we sit and listen to these politicians. It's kind of turgid. It's kind of tedious. You know, it is important, but it's not especially interesting. So what you do is you then bring on a former player from Tottenham Hotspur, or you bring on the commercial, the chief operating officer, or you bring on the director of marketing, or you bring on the manager for overseas development. You may even bring on a player from the past or a current player, and they then start to talk about football. So again, if we go back to this is soft power in terms of getting people to speak English, because it makes it easier then to build relationships. But what you've got here is you're then talking about using players and clubs and other football assets as a way of really, I guess it's almost like fast tracking diplomacy. So, you know, if it's me talking about Tottenham Hotspur, you know, no Qatari is going to sign a deal with a British business on the basis of what I say. But if you bring in Teddy Sheringham, or you bring in Gary Lineker, or you bring in Jurgen Klinsmann, and they talk about their time at Tottenham Hotspur, immediately that's a facilitator of a relationship that might otherwise take a lot longer to build. And that's the essence of soft power. So at this point, what I would direct you to is this ranking of soft power. This ranking of soft power is put together by an organization called Portland Communications. It's a relatively new ranking. I think the first one appeared in 2016 or 2017, probably 2016, if I recall correctly. Interestingly, to begin with, the UK appeared at number 1 in the first couple of iterations. This is the ranking from the end of 2018, 2019, and the French. How dare they? Although, you know, working in a French business school, I guess, you know, I kind of play my part in this. I'm compromised in that sense. I'm batting for two sides. But can you believe it? The French overtook the UK at number 1. Now, if you look at Portland Communications' explanation as to why France moved to number 1 ahead of the UK at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, there are 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is Emmanuel Macron, President Macron, takes soft power very seriously, and you will find that in his electoral manifesto, kind of turning France outwards and being more engaged with the world was very much part of his reformist agenda. So that's the first reason, Macron, its government policy to become a much more powerful soft power force. But the second reason, end of 2018, 2019, I can't take questions at the moment. I'll come back to you in a second, because I have to come out of my screen to be able to then look at the questions. So maybe in a second I'll take a break and come to some of the questions. Of course, what happened in 2018 is France won the World Cup. So even for the French, the power of football, the power of sport, certainly in these soft power terms as we're presenting it, is really important. So for those of you who do choose to go and look, if you look at Portland Communications, when you look at it, and when you this is a screenshot of their webpage. When you click on the French link, it specifically mentions the World Cup. But when you click on Britain, so going back to Britain's number 2, that's not so bad. But again, we lose on penalties, last kick of the game. This is what it says. Now, I'm particularly perturbed that people may be making judgments about me on the basis of Ed Sheeran. I'd far rather people were making judgments about me as a British guy on the basis of the Premier League. But what you'll typically find is if you go to that Portland site, what they consistently do across each of their annual rankings of nations, keeping in mind what I've said about Britain appearing as number one, is they typically will make explicit reference to the Premier League. So in these terms, the Premier League is a soft power asset for Great Britain. Just as McDonald's and Hollywood movies are a soft power asset for the United States, just as pandas are a soft power asset for China, just as IPL cricket and cricket in general is a soft power asset for India, you will typically find the Premier League routinely being identified as a soft power asset for Britain. So what we're saying is that soft power is important because it provides some economic and business leverage. We talked obviously about the British Department for International Trade, going to Doha, going to Qatar, touting for business, taking Tottenham Hotspur along with them. We also see it as being political leverage. And we briefly mentioned about Macron and the importance of that. We've alluded to, but not specifically or explicitly talked about sociocultural leverage, although what I call my taxi driver test, I think fits into that. Because I talked about, you sat with a strange taxi driver, you don't know them, they don't know you. What are you supposed to talk about? How do you make sure that the taxi driver doesn't take advantage of you and charge you a higher fare than they're supposed to? Well, the sociocultural leverage in talking about football, the soft power leverage in talking about football. So I think sociocultural leverage is very much around commonly identifying with a set of values or with a culture or with a way of living that, despite our differences, there may be geographic differences, there may be age differences, there may be political differences, gender differences, there's sociocultural leverage in soft power and sociocultural leverage in the soft power of sport. Now, at this point, I'm just going to duck out of my screen and see what people have been saying to me. Hopefully, it's not a lot of abuse. Oh my God, it is a lot of abuse. No, it isn't a lot of abuse. Danny, yeah, Portland 30 is inadequate. Agree. It's only one measure. I think that's actually, I'm working backwards chronologically through the questions. So Danny, yeah, in my opinion, the Portland 30 is inadequate. It's one measure, and I would agree it's not necessarily the most rigorously constructed ranking. It's just one ranking. One of the things that I would say is that for people working in this field, there's a real opportunity to create more robust, more tangible, more scientific methods for ranking nations, but also for measuring soft power outcomes. And I'll perhaps talk about that a little later. Someone mentioned Gazprom. Don't get me started about Gazprom. I'm not actually going to talk about Gazprom today, but I would love to talk about Gazprom. If you want to talk more about Gazprom, #SportAssist, we can maybe have a conversation about it. We're going to talk about China, people who are talking about China. Somebody asking about sports diplomacy. I'm not a sports diplomatist. What I'm interested in is the role that business plays in all of this. And we're going to talk about in just a short while airline sponsorships. So that kind of goes back to the Gazprom case. So this whole notion of sports sponsorship and soft power, we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, McDonald's. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to scroll really, really quickly. Christoph, Liverpool, the craziness of the COP, emotion in many of its European games, the soft power of Liverpool, discuss. Okay, I'll keep that as an assignment title for later. Thanks for that one. Yeah, Camilla, soft power in the global south, something really important. Nick Anderson, Joga Bonita. YouTube, go onto YouTube and check out the Joga Bonito footage from 2006, 2007, particularly in terms of how that portrays Brazil and what that means for Brazilian soft power and more. The and more bit we'll get to in a second. There's Gavin Price. Middlesbrough could not even win the Transporter Bridge derby versus Newport County. Gavin Price, I will see you afterwards and there will be trouble. Okay. I'm gonna come back out again and go back to share screen, because otherwise I'm going to start hurling abuse at someone, I think. As I say, hashtag sport assist if you want to talk some more about that. Maybe we can talk a little bit more later. Okay. So I thought a good place to start, and I'm many of you will know by now, I'm not a typical academic in the sense that I don't spout long words and I don't give lots of theories, and I like to have a more kind of fluid and open discussion about things. And so I'm not going to bombard you with theories and concepts and other things. But one of the things I very often like to do, and I say this to all of my students, including PhD students, is start with a dictionary. And in this particular case, I thought, okay, start with a dictionary. And I just looked at a couple of dictionary definitions of soft power, of soft and power, and this is what the dictionaries say. Soft, as the name implies, it's very gentle and it's smooth and it's agreeable. And if you go back to what I was saying about the Premier League and learning to speak English and doing trade deals, and hey, I brought Tottenham Hotspur along, and we're going to talk about the Premier League, and we're going to talk about those great games against Arsenal, and we're going to talk about Pochettino and the Champions League final. We're going to talk about Jermaine Defoe, and it's all very smooth and agreeable. And so that's the essence. It's not hard. It's soft. And in terms of power, the word power is actually really significant, because I think soft power is not about being nice. It's not about being nice. So it's not about countries saying, please like us, please. I think to a certain extent it is, but it's about power, and power is about getting other people to do things. It's about getting them, it's about impacting upon their motives. It's about trying to get them to identify with you and your country and your sport as opposed to other countries. So it's about influencing their motives. It's about influencing their attitudes. So Britain does a lot of bad stuff. We've done a lot of bad stuff over the last 300 years. Britain has done a lot of bad stuff that really a lot of people should be holding us to account for. But when I get into the front seat of a taxi in different parts of the world, nobody ever says to me, hey, can we talk to you about colonialism? They want to talk about Premier League football. So there is something about power. It's about shaping people's attitudes towards a country. So people's attitudes towards England are shaped by the Premier League, not by colonialism. That's the soft power of football. But it's also not just about motives and attitudes. It's also about behaviors. So it's about soft power trying to influence behaviors. It's trying to get people to do things. Now, I'm going to mention an example, a Middle Eastern example. The case I'll use is Dubai. I think the way in which Dubai has used soft power is incredible. Now, I could have used Qatar. I didn't use Qatar because we could go on for days and days and days about Qatar, and I think many people talk about the soft power of Qatar. There are people writing about the soft power of Qatar. Fewer people write about the soft power of Dubai. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the soft power of Dubai in a moment. But if you think about what Dubai has become over the last 20 years, and if I was to ask the question, how many of you have now been to Dubai? How many of you been there over the last 20 years? There's a lot of people would say, well, I've been there for whatever reason. So it's not just about motives and attitudes. It's actually about behaviors. It's about getting people to do things. So keep in mind that as we go through, this word power is really powerful. It's really important. So in terms of, actually, let's just go back. I've got two quite long slides that I'm going to show you and leave you to read. But before we get into these and you dive into them, what I would like to do is really to distinguish between soft power and hard power. And hard power is, as its name implies, and there is a continuum or a spectrum of hard power, I guess. And if you look at what Donald Trump has just done with the World Health Organization, we're not going to give you any more money because we don't trust you. Full stop. And that is an example of hard power. That is Trump using what power he perceives that he has to sanction an organization that he has issues with. But if you come across the continuum, inevitably what you have is military conflict. In simple terms, military conflict. So you have something that we want, so we're going to send the troops in. So I don't want to get into this whole debate about what hard power is and what the distinctions are between hard power and soft power and where the boundaries may be drawn and where the lines are blurred. What I'm interested in, I'm a business school guy who's interested in sport and how soft power is starting to influence the world of sport. But I think it's important that you do think about this distinction between hard power and soft power. Soft power is a very, I guess it's quintessentially a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon, in the sense that you don't send the tanks in, you don't send the troops in, you don't bomb countries. What you do is you use soft power. You try to influence people in a different way. Just a quick aside, for those of you who are scholars of soft power in whatever form it comes, obviously what happens to soft power post-COVID-19, I think, is a really, really interesting issue. And again, linking it to the example that I talked about earlier of Middle Eastern airlines. If we take Emirates Airlines or Qatar Airways or Etihad Airways, those sponsorship deals are very interesting. They have a soft power dimension to them. I'm going to talk in a moment about it. But given that currently none of them are flying planes, they're all incurring huge financial losses. It's going to be very interesting to see how that changes or adjusts the soft power dynamic of which these airlines are part. I'm just going to leave that hanging for the moment and kind of move on. So I've got 2 slides now, lots of text. So you're intelligent people. I'll leave you to read the text and I'll pick some keywords out. Essentially, as you see there, it's about I think fundamentally it's about attractiveness of a nation and communicating the attractiveness of that nation so that that nation can use its assets and project soft power as a means through which to achieve whatever ends it seeks to achieve. And I'm going to use 4 examples of countries where soft power has been used in conjunction with sport to achieve particular ends. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about motives and attitudes, it's about behaviors, it's about getting things that you want. On this particular slide, I would pick out the word legitimacy. And there are certain nations out there, and I will say Qatar again, I'll say Saudi Arabia as well. I think Qatar and Saudi Arabia have used and are using sport as a means through which to project soft power because they are seeking legitimacy in the world. Now, there are some of us in the room today, or in the webinar today, who would say, well, I have particular views of these 2 countries. I think they're very much the same as one another. Qatar only has 1 land border with Saudi Arabia. And so you may be inclined to stereotype and generalize and say what Qatar is trying to do is also what Saudi Arabia is trying to do. My view is, in the broadest possible terms, I would agree. In soft power terms, I would agree. In soft power and sport terms, I would agree. But they are actually quite different. And the legitimacy that Saudi Arabia is seeking and that Qatar is seeking, they are actually 2 different things. So again, there's an interesting debate, hashtag sport assist, or otherwise I'll see you outside school later, we can fight about it. But there is something interesting about what is legitimacy, what does it mean, what constitutes legitimacy, how is Saudi Arabia and Qatar seeking it through sport? For that matter, how is Britain seeking it? How is France seeking it? How is the United States seeking it? How is China seeking it? And so on and so forth. But we'll come to that in a short while. There's also something too, and I'll pick out a couple of other terms. Image. So soft power is connected to image. I'm going to say a little bit in just a second about nation branding. But going back to my conversation in the Italian hotel with the Swedish guy who loved English football, you know, the essence of English football is it's an image in his mind. It's about fast and hard and goals and excitement and tension and drama. That's the image that he's built up. And I'm sure the British government, and for that matter, the British football authorities, would be very happy with the image that this Swedish guy has in his mind of English football. The other word that I pick out there is trust. So you trust. So why aren't lots of us? Why aren't lots of us watching Uzbekistani football? Why aren't lots of us watching Kenyan football? Why aren't lots of us watching Peruvian football? Well, many people around the world, we trust that if we watch La Liga, we're going to get a particular type of football. We trust if we watch the Premier League, we're going to get a particular type of football. So soft power is linked to trust. It's linked to image. It's linked to legitimacy. And as I've said, overriding that, the way in which Joseph Nye presented it, recalling the reading that I mentioned earlier, it's about attractiveness. So again, just some of the other ways in which people have talked about or defined soft power. I guess ultimately the underpinning or the underlying notion that what you as a nation are trying to do through soft power and sport is you're trying to bring about an alignment between your country and another country, or between your country and a target audience overseas. Is you're enabling something to happen between you. And as I say, it's about motives and attitudes and behaviors. But what's also involved in doing that is not just trust. And the one I'm going to pick out here is a feel-good factor. So for those of you who right at the very start told me about your Premier League team and why it's your Premier League team and why you love them, etc., etc., what people weren't doing is you weren't saying, well, Manchester United are shit, and I absolutely hate Arsenal, and English football is rubbish. None of you said that. What you did is you were really, really keen. You loved it. You were all loving it, telling me your teams and your reasons why. So there was a feel-good factor there, and I felt that too. I was actually really, kind of heartened, and I felt really good that so many people just straight away, we've never met each other before. Many of us have never met each other, and yet straight away we were prepared to talk about this. So again, thinking about soft power and Premier League and football and sport, there's something about creating a feel-good factor that is part of the soft power effect. So that wasn't the slide that I was expecting. Let me just go back to this slide. That's the slide that I was expecting. Let me just go back a few slides. And now we've got this sense of what we mean by soft power and the role that it plays, hopefully, in economics and business and sport. We know it's linked to diplomacy and international relations. We also know that it's linked to kind of international politics, global politics. But I wanted to highlight a few things, and the middle one in the list there, business. This today is me making a claim for business and management that soft power is a business and management phenomenon as well as being a political phenomenon. But I think the interesting thing too is that soft power does link to nation branding. as you were logging on at the start, I noticed there were people from Spain, from Germany, from Italy, from South Africa, from China, from Australia, from Austria. I'd pose a simple question to you: what's your nation's brand? You don't need to answer me now, but I think that's a really interesting question. Very often, when I say to people, "What's your nation's brand?" what I noticed in some of the comments down the sidebar when you began talking about the Premier League, somebody had actually posted in the side chat, "The English live for football," and it is true. There is an inextricable link between certainly brand England, but I would argue brand Britain. Brand Britain and football are synonymous with each other. They're inextricably linked. Again, it's like Hollywood and movies. This is all part of the branding of these physical spaces. So I think for me, soft power links to nation branding. We're going to talk about Dubai in a moment. We're going to talk about Tokyo. We're going to talk a little bit about Qatar. We're also going to mention China as well. There is something about diplomacy. There is a link between soft power and diplomacy. And we're going to look specifically towards the end at China and China's stadium diplomacy, which I think can also be conceived of as a form of soft power. For the political scientists in the room, please don't pursue me. I'm a business guy. I'm kind of edging my way forward, trying to understand in business and sporting terms what this all means. But I wanted to highlight the two notions at the end here of propaganda and sport washing. And I don't necessarily want to get into this debate today, but I think that what very often happens is there is confusion and there is conflation around soft power, propaganda, and sport washing. In very simplistic terms, there does seem to be something very 20th, very kind of mid 20th century about the term propaganda. And if you think about the word propaganda, you immediately begin to think about the Cold War and spreading misinformation and so on and so forth. Is this fake news? Is this soft power? There's an interesting debate to have there. And what I would prefer to do, certainly in terms of my conception of soft power, is that it is different to propaganda. It is something different. There nevertheless is an interesting debate to be had about the similarities and differences between soft power and propaganda. The other one that I also want to highlight is sport washing. Now, I personally have real problems with this term sport washing, which I don't think is particularly well defined. And I don't think the debate around sport washing is particularly mature. It's emergent. It needs much greater debate, much greater work doing around it. I think what a lot of people would do is they would point at the likes of Qatar and say Qatar is sport washing. But I'm sure decision makers inside Qatar would say, we're not sport washing. What we're doing is we're trying to create and to project soft power. So again, I think there's a similar debate to be had around, is sport washing soft power and is soft power sport washing? Are they two completely different things, or is there some overlap? So again, some really interesting debates to be had. But in a 1 hour webinar, I don't think we can necessarily talk about these. So let's just quickly take a break, and I'm just going to quickly run through. Yeah, okay. I'm just looking for the abuse. There's no abuse, so I'm happy. Lots of really interesting questions. I'll try and come back to it at the end. I'm just checking in, make sure you're all there as well. Now, I'm going to make no value judgment about Arsenal at all. I'm not going to make any judgment about this particular player either. Although I think in soft power terms, if we want to talk about Germany and Turkish immigration into Germany and Gastarbeiter and Özil, meeting President Erdogan, and that's for another web. We could do a million webinars. So that's another webinar for another day, maybe for somebody else to do. But what I wanted to do in particular is to pick up on the shirt sponsor, Fly Emirates. And I'm going to come out and stop sharing again. I'm going to ask a question, and I'd be really interested to hear your answers, or to see your answers. So if you could type your answer for me. Of the 211 people who are here listening to this, how many of you in 1995 had been to Dubai? For all those people who are saying I wasn't even born, just get out of here, okay? Just get out of here. So in 1995, one person, so out of 212 people here, one person had been to Dubai in 1995. Somebody else, just looking at it quickly, I didn't ask whether you live in Dubai. It's 2020 and I still haven't been to Dubai. Okay. It's overrated. It's overrated. Let me go back to share screen. Okay, so thanks for that. So for those of you who said you weren't even born, okay, I'm old. I don't have hair anymore. I'm old. I'll just quit. For those who answered, one said, I went to Dubai I'd been to Dubai in 1995. One other person said, I went in 1998. So what we're saying is, within most of us 25 years ago had never been to Dubai, me included. I'd never been to 25 years ago. When I was old enough to travel to Dubai, I was like 10 or 12, I think. I hadn't been to Dubai either. And yet what we've very rapidly gone from is a situation of probably many of you, and I would speculate that if you'd asked me in 1995, Simon, can you show me on the map where Dubai is? I'd have said, no, I can't. And what I find really interesting is when I speak to people about Qatar, or for that matter, when I speak to people about Abu Dhabi, can you tell me where Abu Dhabi is in the map? Most people can't tell. They can't show you. They can't tell you. And so even now, there are many people still in the world still who can't tell you. But in the case of Dubai, 1995, most of us hadn't been there. So let me just come back out of the screen again. So how many of the 211 of you out there, 210 of you, 209 people are leaving, how many of you been to Dubai now? Yes, 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 yes. How many of the people who haven't been, how many of you would like to go? Okay, you're doing my job for me. So what's really interesting is 25 years ago, one of us had been there. 25 years ago, most of us probably wouldn't have been able to say where on a map this country is. Now, I would say it seems to me, maybe as many as half of you have been there. Most of the other half would actually like to go there. And so Dubai has very quickly risen to prominence in the global psyche. It's a place that we know. It's a place that we go to. It's a place that many of us want to go to. It's a place that I think has become aspirational. And many people will speak about, if once I've got a bit of money, I'm going to go to Dubai. and I'm going to go on a holiday there, and I'm going to stay in a particular hotel, and I'm going to go to the Palm, and I'm going to go to Dubai Mall and visit the shops. And so whilst many of us talk about Qatar and soft power, I think the way in which Dubai has constructed, projected, and been able to effect behavioral change as a consequence of soft power is just phenomenal. Now, you'd be interested, just kind of raise this as a side issue. Going back to what we said about, for example, sport washing, or going back to what we said, for example, about propaganda, or going on to what we might think of the negative impact or the negative aspects of soft power projection. Qatar takes a pretty bad rap. Saudi Arabia takes a pretty bad rap. We talk about human rights abuses or immigrant worker abuses in conjunction with those two countries. When we talk about Dubai, we just don't talk about these things. What we talk about is glitz and glamour and beach holidays and football shirt sponsorships. And so I think the way in which Dubai has used soft power and sport is really phenomenal. Now, of course, I'm giving one example here. And what is significant about this example for me is that if you remember, the Emirates shirt deal started in conjunction with the Emirates Stadium deal. And the Emirates Stadium deal started at a time when Arsenal were moving from Highbury to what? The Emirates Stadium. So it has only ever been the Emirates Stadium. So this is something that has deeply buried itself into people's consciousness, so that we have an unquestioning relationship with Dubai. We just don't question it. We don't talk about Dubai human rights abuses. We don't talk about Dubai propaganda. We don't talk about Dubai and sport washing. We just accept that Dubai does what it does because it's a great place to go. It's a great place to transit at the airport. It's a great place to have a beach holiday. And a lot of that, not all of it, obviously, but a lot of that has ridden in on the back of its sports sponsorship portfolio. Now, for those of you who are saying, "Oh my God, he hates Dubai," I don't hate Dubai. I've been there several times. I find it really interesting. It's certainly a very different kind of experience or atmosphere when you're there to how it is in other Gulf countries. If you were to say to me, "Hey, get on the plane today, Simon, and go and spend a week there," of course I would. So I'm not disrespecting Dubai or criticizing it, nor am I advocating or praising. I'm just trying to understand what it's been doing. And so from the perspective of soft power and sponsorships, and I notice Nick Burton is in the room today. So Nick Burton, Paul Widdop, and I have just published a paper in the Journal of Political Marketing on soft power sponsorships, where we do talk about, for example, Gazprom, but we do also refer to, for example, airlines. What we're seeing is that through sponsorships, and particularly this Emirates airline sponsorship, this is very much about building the profile and prominence, not just of the airline, but also of Dubai Airport. And as many of you will know, Dubai Airport is now the world's biggest airport. It's the world's biggest hub for transferring from one flight to another. So it's about profile and prominence. It's about awareness and preference. And going back to what I was saying earlier about effecting behavioral change, you go back to 1995 when I talked about how many of us would know Dubai at that point. I would suggest that the preference of international travelers at that point would be to transfer through Amsterdam, or to transfer through Heathrow, or to transfer through Frankfurt. And yet what we've now got is people's preferences are changing. So when they fly to Australia, they don't prefer to transfer in Singapore or Hong Kong. They prefer to transfer in Dubai. So what we've got is a sponsorship of a series of clubs and a series of venues being used to raise profile, raise prominence, raise awareness, shape people's preferences. And this gives, in turn, some legitimacy. And we've talked about legitimacy previously. You know, Dubai now is Emirates Airlines is a legitimate airline. We see it as for many of us, we see it as a number one choice. It's our main preference. We also see Dubai Airport as a transfer hub. We also see Dubai as a holiday destination. People even go to Dubai for the weekend from Europe for a beach holiday. You know, so there's a kind of legitimacy as a tourism destination. I think there's some legitimacy as a country. We see this as a country in its own right that plays a role in the world, that plays a part in the world, that's linked to tourism, that's linked to airlines, that's linked to sport. And so in turn, we then have clearly a country that has a vision, a very clear strategy. That strategy is bound up in tourism, in air travel, in sport. And what that has enabled the country to do, what has it enabled Dubai to do, and for that matter has enabled Emirates Airlines to do, is to build a brand, is to build a country brand, to build a nation brand, to build the airline brand. And so what we can see in both in terms of the airline, the country, the sponsorships, are these issues around positioning and narrative and dialogue. And the narrative and dialogue, just to reiterate, we don't, people tend not to say bad things about Dubai. You know, many people will talk about British colonialism. Many people will talk about Saudi Arabian and human rights abuses. Many people will talk about United States and the power and the exploitation of power overseas by the United States. But when we talk about Dubai, most of the time we say very nice things. We say very positive things. So you can see how, as a component part of this country and its strategy and its brand, soft power and sport and sponsorships have been very, very important. Now, in turn, what we've begun to see is this has really been part of it, of Dubai's industrial development. And I think one of the crucial things is that sport and soft power and sponsorships have been connected to, for example, events. Many of you will know that the Asian Football Championship last year was staged there. We supposedly we were supposed to have Expo 2020 in Dubai this year. And so you begin to see the interconnectedness and I use the word embeddedness there of these various elements. And as I say, for me, I think what's particularly interesting is the way in which the sponsorships that Emirates are engaged in have been used to contribute to national strategy, to the nation's brand, to business development, to industrial development, and obviously in this particular case, sponsorship. So that's soft power and sponsorships. I've got three more of these, and then I'll conclude, and then maybe if we've got the time, and I'm trying to see what the time is. Yeah, we may have some time for questions. Next one is Tokyo 2020 or Tokyo 2021 or Tokyo 2022 or Tokyo whatever. Now, I find Tokyo 2020 particularly interesting because I have a real affection for Japan and a real interest in Japan, as I do for East Asia in general. One of the things that has occupied my time over the last 10 years is what seems to have been China's rise, and in many ways, I'm not going to use the word stagnation, but Japan plateauing. And what I've seen is, I guess in global competitive terms, China becoming the preeminent East Asian force, and Japan not quite being the preeminent force as it has been. What we've seen over the last 5 years in particular is China taking sport very seriously. But if you go back further than that to the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games, we're talking about possibly the last 2 decades in which China politically and increasingly industrially and economically seeing sport in a much more dynamic, strategic and progressive way than Japan. But what we've begun to see over the last 7-8 years is Japan beginning to take sport more seriously, to think about sport in soft power terms, but also to refresh its view of the way in which sport and soft power can make a contribution to Japanese economic and industrial development. And quick aside, this is why I think the postponement of Tokyo 2020 was a very long time in being decided, and it's also important that it wasn't postponed, that it does take place. The reason for saying this is that Shinzo Abe, the president, has an election that he needs to fight in September this year, and he really his big sports soft power project was very much about creating an economic bounce from the staging of the games, but also about creating and projecting a new image of Japan that would thrust Japan forwards again in global terms, so that the world sees Japan in a different way, so that would then enhance his electoral prospects. Now, again, I'm not a politician, I'm a business and management guy, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. For those of you who are rugby fans and looked at the Rugby World Cup, I watched the Rugby World Cup in September, October last year. I think this was all very much part of Japanese sport policy. It was very much part of Japan's soft power play. It was about conveying a particular image of Japan to the world. And for those of you who are rugby fans and did follow this, you'll know that as we came out of the tournament, lots of people were making really positive associations with Japan. Lots of people, and great atmosphere in the stadiums, incredibly well constructed, very clean and well run venues, very friendly people, very hospitable, and so these individual words are very much about sport and soft power and projecting an image and nation branding and trying to create points of attractiveness. And effectively what Japan is now trying to do is to effect behavioral change amongst key target audiences across the world. So just to say a few things, what we know about Japan is over the last 3 decades, its economy has stuttered. It has an aging population. It's got health and lifestyle issues, and it underperforms in relative terms in many global sports. And so initially through the successful bidding for the 2019 Rugby World Cup, and subsequently in bidding for the Olympics and Paralympic Games, what we've seen is through the 2011 Basic Act on Sport in Japan is a commitment to promoting sport as a national asset, to supporting the industrial development of sport, and also then linking this to nation brand, the nation's image, the contribution that Japan makes to the global narrative of sport, but at the same time also contributing to the improvements in health and lifestyle, and ensuring that Japan performs more effectively in global sport. And again, just quickly going back to the Rugby World Cup, many of you will know that the Japanese rugby team performed exceptionally well. And again, even the qualities and characteristics, the words that people were using to describe the Japanese national rugby team were, I think, an illustration of what Japanese government has tried to do through its policy on soft power and sport. But again, it's in terms of the economic and industrial assets, the commercial assets, that I think it's particularly interesting for me. And this is where we begin to overlap again into sponsorship. But you'll notice the penultimate point on the slide here is it must strengthen its brand and move beyond established associations with electronics, manga, and sushi. There's the comma after established shouldn't be there, so that's an error on my part. If you think about Japan, for many of us, when we think about Japan, we think about certain things, and we may well think about sushi, or we may well think about manga, or we may well think about electronics. We may think about other things as well, but for many of us, these are kind of old established, and in some cases might actually be quite tired associations with Japan. So one of the things that the Japanese government is trying to do is to create this new, fresher, more vibrant, more outward looking. And this is one of the other things is government in Japan is trying to create a more outward looking country that is more engaged globally, so that it can compete with the likes of its near rival China, which is very outward looking in the way that it engages with the world. And so the Olympic Games is one example of trying to do that. And the case that I would pick in particular, and again, another name check for Paul Widder. Paul and I ran a network analysis of Japanese companies associated with the Olympics and Paralympic Games. And more than 70 plus Japanese companies have signed up to be a sponsor or a partner of the 2020 Olympics and Paralympic Games. So this is the opportunity. This is the soft power effect playing through of bidding to host events, hosting those events, trying to use these as events as a means through which to create and project soft power, using that soft power as a platform to, for instance, promote industrial development, to promote economic opportunities, to sell the products, to sell the goods and services that Japanese companies are producing through, as I say, in this particular case, sponsorships in the Olympics. Two more, starting with this guy. And this is still, for me, an intriguing example, not least because technically, notionally, I'm now based in Paris. So if I'm based in Paris, I'm supposed to support my local team, right? I'm supposed to support the big team in town. And I look at this team and I look at this player and I think about the club's ownership, and I have all these associations in my head. And I know there are people out there who've already sent me messages saying there are other Parisian clubs available that you could, Racing Club Paris and all. So I know these things. But Paris Saint-Germain and Neymar and Qatar Sports Investments intrigue me for lots of different reasons. When I finally retire, I'll write a book about it. But for the moment, let me just talk about the soft players, the soft power of athletes, or the soft power in this particular case of football players. I suppose more generally, we could talk about the soft power of athletes. If we talk about the soft power of athletes, we then get into talking about Usain Bolt and Jamaica, for example, or we get into talking about Yao Ming and the soft power of Chinese basketball. We get into talking about Ferrari and Nuvolari and racing drivers and the soft power and what that means for Italy. But in this particular case, we'll stick with soft power and players and Neymar and Paris Saint-Germain and Qatar Sports Investments. Now, you'll know and you'll recall, I'm sure many of you will recall, that Neymar was signed from Barcelona by Paris Saint-Germain in 2017 for 222 million euros. Now that's just mad. That's just mad. And if you recall that at the time, the world transfer record, the standing world transfer record at that time was 105 million euros, and that was the fee paid by Manchester United to Juventus for Paul Pogba. So there's some symmetry there. We're bringing Paul Pogba and Manchester United back into this. But for Paris Saint-Germain and their Qatari owners to have paid 222 million euros at that time for that player was arguably, certainly from a purely economic perspective, was unfathomable. There was just simply no need to do it. Now, to add to the mystery and the intrigue around this, and to be honest, to add to the perplexity of people generally, shortly afterwards, a deal was then agreed to sign Mbappe from Monaco for 135 million euros. So you're talking about the best part, nearly of 400 million euros to buy 2 players. Why did they do that? Well, just as a quick aside, you've got to keep in mind that at the time, Neymar arguably was the best player in the world. And Mbappe arguably was the best young player in the world. So effectively, Qatar has bought the 2 best players in their respective age categories at the same time. And I know there were some complexities around the transfers and when the fees were paid, etc., etc. But symbolically, and I think that's the crucial thing, symbolically, there was something really important in this. So as many of you will know, that at that time, in June 2017, Saudi Arabia and its allies, including Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Egypt, and several others, cut off diplomatic ties with Qatar. Now, again, that's another webinar. We can do that. I think that's another one in our long list of webinars that need to be done. That's another one that we can do another time. Suffice to say, Qatar was diplomatically isolated. This feud was incredibly bitter, very, very fractious. One of the things that Saudi Arabia threatened to do was to build a trench. Keeping in mind what I said earlier, Qatar only has one land border with Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia had threatened to to dig a trench between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and fill it full of nuclear waste, radioactive waste. So this was off the scale. This was a really, really bitter, deep, and fractious feud. And so I think what the Neymar transfer was, for me, was it was in many ways it was a signaling device, and it was a soft power play intended to do several things. I think the first thing that it was intended to do was to raise the profile of Qatar as being the good guy at a time when it was involved in a dispute with nations that I think, whilst Qatar wasn't casting them as bad guys, Qatar was trying to differentiate itself, was trying to distinguish itself by making itself out as a good guy. We are a football nation. We like good football. We like good players. We like fast attacking football. All of those things that you like, Britain, all of those things that you like, France, all of those things that you like, Brazil, we like those things too. And so in that sense, it was about distinguishing the country in a very subtle, gentle, attractive, soft power way, using the signing of these 2 players. But I think it was also about kind of short-term team performance and for that matter, longer-term team performance. As many of you will know, as you travel the world, and I'm always saying, when I was walking around Lyon, so when I moved to Lyon 6 weeks ago, I was walking around Lyon, and the number of Manchester United shirts that I saw in Lyon, and I couldn't help but think, what the hell is wrong with you people? You've got your own football club. Leave Manchester United alone. Leave them out of this. But by walking around Lyon and seeing lots and lots of Manchester United shirts, we know what the power of football clubs is. And what's really interesting is that what we're now beginning to see is lots and lots of people around the world wearing Paris Saint-Germain tops with Neymar on the back. And we know about the Jordan collaboration, and we know about some of those other PSG, Nike, Jordan fashion collaborations. And whenever I go onto the PSG website and I look at some of the fashion houses that PSG has got its collaboration with, this is all part of the soft power of Qatar and the soft power of Paris Saint-Germain. But there's more to it than that. There's also something about playing success and engaging fans, because economic and commercially, financially, this is lucrative. It's beneficial to Qatar. But at the same time, it brings legitimacy to Qatar. So Qatar is part of the global football narrative in a way that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it wasn't. I think one of the other things and the final point there is also a soft power instrument being utilized for signaling purposes. What Qatar was trying to say to its rivals was, don't bully us. Don't bully us. We've got the money. we've got the inclination, we've got the intent to be able to front you out and to fight you in this. So I think what was also happening with that Neymar signing, this was very much about Qatar effectively, metaphorically putting up a finger to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to Dubai, to Abu Dhabi, and saying, you know, so for as long as you want to do this, we've got the money to be able to do this. So I think there was a further purpose to this as well. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. And so the final example is around China. And as many of you will know, just as the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, intrigues me, so East Asia intrigues me. So Japan is one part of that. China is the other part of it. And what we're going to do in a couple of weeks' time in one of the other webinars that we're doing, we'll talk a little bit more about China and soft power and football. But China is similarly engaged in policy and strategy related to sport, especially football, for soft power reasons. And again, you know, I take you back to the previous the previous slide about Japan. Excuse me. I take you back to the previous slide about Japan and established notions of Japan. And when people talk about Japan, what do they talk about? And of course, when we talk about Japan, we talk about sushi, and we talk about electronics, and we talk about manga. If you think about how we talk about China, well, if we think about the way historically the world talks about China, they're communists and they grow rice and they don't have very much money, and they live in high-rise blocks, and they went through a cultural revolution, and there's something about human rights. So the narrative about China that has built up over the last 60, 70, 80 years is a narrative that China now wants to change. And what China as a country, what Chinese government wants us to do, is to talk about China and to conceive of China, to perceive of China, to think about China, to behave towards China in a different way than we always have done. And so sport and football is very much part of that. Now, if I take me as an example, 20 years ago, I had no interest in Chinese football. You know, I can't tell you the great stars of Chinese football 20 years ago. I just can't. But certainly over the last decade, and probably a little longer than that, over the last 15 years, I've started to take an interest. And so by writing about, by talking about, by tweeting about, by attending conferences and discussing with delegates about Chinese football, I've become part of the Chinese soft power football narrative. And I think this is really, I've been part of it. So I've fallen, can I say fallen victim to it? Certainly I've been a recipient of it. And even by now, talking today about it, I'm serving as an instrument or as a channel through which China projects soft power through sport. As I say, 2 weeks we'll talk a little bit more about it. What I want to do today is just to mention a very specific example, and there are only two or three slides left, and then we'll finish. Is to talk about soft power and stadiums. Because I think what China is doing with stadiums is at one level it's a form of diplomacy, and so we go back to what we were talking about earlier about diplomacy. But I also think it's a way of stadiums are a way of generating and projecting soft power, particularly in certain parts of the world. So I'm going to use the example of Africa in particular. And start by saying very simply that there is a long history in Africa of stadiums being constructed for various sporting events by China on behalf of African nations effectively using two approaches. One is to just build those stadiums free, or the other is to build those stadiums on behalf of African nations using what are called soft loans. And those soft loans are loans that are given to governments at considerably below market rates of interest. So in other words, it's cheap money. And we see this. So if we look at the African Cup of Nations, and with the exception of last year's African Cup of Nations in Egypt, if we think about Cameroon, we think about Angola, we think about some of the other more recent hosts of the African Cup of Nations. Typically, their stadiums have been constructed by Chinese investors, Chinese government, either free of charge at the point of consumption. That's the crucial thing. Free of charge at the point of consumption, or alternatively through the provision of soft loans. Now, my first degree was economics. And if there are any other economics graduates in the webinar still today, I think we've probably got about 180 people still left. All the economists in the room will tell you economics 101. So economics 9 o'clock, year one, day one, economics 101, they will tell you is there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I think that really is a characteristic of the way in which China has used soft power and stadiums and diplomacy. It might seem as though the stadiums are being given free of charge, or it might seem as though those stadiums are being funded through soft loan provision, but in reality, they're not. Now, again, there's no implied criticism of China here, nor am I advocating for China here. What I am doing is to highlight that this is a means through which China is trying to get something that it wants. So it goes right back to what we said initially about soft power is about motives and attitudes and effecting behavioral change. And crucially, what China wants in Africa is natural resources. So if you go back to the African Cup of Nations in Angola, Angola's biggest natural resource is oil. And immediately after China had given free stadiums to Angola, coincidentally, Angola's biggest customer for oil and oil-related products was China. So China is now the biggest consumer of Angolan oil. So typically what's happening in this particular case is China is using sports stadiums, and more specifically sports events, as a way of getting natural resources, of getting oil, of accessing ores, so you know, copper and different types of ores, of accessing rare earths. So for those of you who've got mobile phones, you've got rare earths in your mobile phone. Those rare earths are called rare earths because they're rare. They can only be found in certain parts of the world, Australia, for example, but also in China. And so what we're seeing is China seeking to gain access to these rare earths and ores and petroleum products using what some people would call stadium diplomacy, but I would link to soft power. Now, though some of you will know that last year's Cup of Nations was supposed to take place in Cameroon. Amazingly, stadiums constructed in conjunction with China by Cameroon on the basis of free stadiums, soft loans, exactly the same game plan. However, there were organizational issues in Cameroon, which meant that hosting rights were taken away and allocated to Egypt for last year's African Cup of Nations. Stadiums were already there, no stadiums, no soft power, no diplomacy through stadium construction. So what does China do? Well, interestingly, China used the event as the basis for Huawei rolling out its 5G network in Africa. So the first 5G network coverage was launched in Egypt during the African Cup of Nations. Huawei wasn't originally scheduled to be a sponsor. It moved very quickly to do that. Many of you will know there are some really interesting global, political, industrial, commercial issues around Huawei. That's another webinar for another day. That's another, add it to the list. We'll do Huawei another day. But you can see the way in which some countries are using their political and industrial assets, economic assets, to gain access to what they want. And in this particular case, it was around telecommunications and 5G and Huawei and China and the rollout and getting what they want. And so I've gone on a little longer than I anticipated, but hey, there we are. Just some conclusions. I'll be very kind of flippant and brief. And soft power is there. It's a growing phenomenon. It's not just something that Saudi Arabia and China do. It's something that France does, Britain does it, Germany does it, the United States does it, South Africa does it. Lots of countries do it. It's a relatively new phenomenon. Further work is needed. There's some things there, for example, how does it work? What are its effects? How should these effects be measured? Is sport the way in which we project soft power? So is it purely the means to a soft power end, or is sport a soft power end in itself? I think that's an interesting question. There's also something about what's the soft power scape? Who are the key stakeholders in this soft power scape? My webinar today talking about Emirates and talking about Huawei and talking about Neymar and Qatar Sports investments. Am I part of that soft power landscape or not? So I think there's something interesting too about soft power scapes. So I'm not going to go on too much further. People know me by now. I go on for a long time. So that's an hour and 40 minutes, I think. It was only supposed to be 90 minutes. So let me wrap that up quickly and say #SportAssist, or email me, or tweet me, or send me a LinkedIn message, whatever. What I want to do is thank you for listening. I'll look at the questions in just a second in case there are any real kind of hot topics, burning issues, and people are still around. Email address is there. You want to send me a message on Twitter, you'll find me there. As I said in previous webinars, I'm not in the business of selling here, but my team have told me that I've got to do some selling. We got great programs. I'm going to leave it at that. Fantastic looking, amazing looking group of people, fantastic programs, great business school. Say no more. Okay. So thank you for being around. If you choose to leave now, that's fine. I'm just going to escape the screen and just see there are lots of questions, lots of messages. Yeah. I can pick up. Do we need more academic research on British and Japanese companies? Yes. I think we need lots more research on sponsorship generally as a form of soft power. Scandinavian airlines and Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Look at IKEA. IKEA is a form of Swedish soft power. Zlatan Ibrahimovic is a form of Swedish soft power. Christian Eriksen is a form of Danish soft power. I think this is all really, really interesting. I think you could actually arrange you could run a soft power conference, a soft power and sport conference, and look at this from lots of different perspectives. But I think even if we look at Scandinavia and soft power of IKEA, soft power of Zlatan, interesting. Sorry, I'm working backwards through these. You are based in Paris, but you work for EMLYON. So should you support Olympique Lyon? I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Just bear with me. Yeah. So Nicola, Emirates is going to sponsor 17 out of 20 League One Ligue 1 teams next year. I think what's manifesting itself, if you look at Paris Saint-Germain, what Paris Saint-Germain's portfolio of sponsors represents, and what now Emirates is trying to do, I don't know if I would specifically talk about soft power. I think it needs to be broadened out into political disputes and international relations and industrial conflict. You know, that's a really interesting one to watch. Turkish Airlines, great one. Beko, that's the other one in Turkey, Beko. But Turkish Airlines, add to Turkish Airlines, Aeroflot, Russian state airline, and their sponsorships. Visit Rwanda. Okay, Visit Rwanda. That's another one. So to add to, so we've got Gazprom, we've got Huawei. Visit Rwanda is another one. That's another webinar, another time. Maybe I should just do free, give up my job and do free webinars. So I think that's an interesting one. UAE, Qatar, the Emirates, Abu Dhabi. We'll try to talk a little bit more about that next week. I've got to live. I've got to eat and drink. That's an interesting one. I think what I would say at this point, just cool questions, really massively cool questions. And this is what I'm really interested in. I like doing these webinars because typically the questions are very, very good. So if you want to talk more about them, these things, drop me a line and we'll talk. And when campuses open back up across the world, come to Paris and we'll drink coffee or drink beer or drink wine, or so we'll do something, and we'll talk about some of these things. But I'm gonna end at that point and just say thanks for the questions, thanks for being around. This has been recorded. We will post it online, possibly tomorrow. If you want to carry on talking, we'll find other means and other channels to do so. So thanks for being around. Thanks. Bye.